Today I'm speaking with Brant Entrekin. Brant is a philosopher currently pursuing his PhD in philosophy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he also teaches. His work spans social political philosophy with a focus on epistemology, philosophy of social justice, and religious studies. His latest paper, AI-mediated mystical experiences, is a deeply interesting and provocative meditation on meditation, in which he examines the nature of mystical experiences, surveys our relationship with chatbots, and asks us to consider a future in which AI can give us, to borrow from French writer Romain Rolland, that oceanic feeling which was once the preserve of the more saintly among us. I'll be discussing these ideas with Brant and look forward to giving the AI skeptics maybe one more thing to be skeptical about. Welcome to Second Orders, Brant. It's good to have you.
Thank you for having me, Shane. I'm excited to be here.
I'd like to begin by asking you to constrain the argument for us. Mystical experiences are by definition a broad church. So take us through the framework you borrow from William James, the psychological preconditions for mediated mystical experiences, and why you think, in principle at least, chatbots could serve as a viable conduit to such experiences.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that, as you said, I think it's important when we start by thinking about mystical experiences. For me, it all starts with the work from William James. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, he's the first president of the American Psychological Association. And in the late 1800s, he gives the Gifford Lectures, which now have been composed into the varieties of religious experience. And one of the lectures that James gives is on mystical experiences, where James, both as a philosopher and as a psychologist, he's trying to really unpack this kind of experiential side of religious experience, where there seems to be, even when we have this, like, as you said, broad church of religious experiences, there seems to be something special about something we might call like these mystical experiences, like these kinds of transcendent or higher order kinds of religious experiences that not every single religious person will have, but maybe we associate with like very particularly religious people, like monks or nuns, or, those who really, really feel the pull of religion. So James, being a good psychologist, he breaks out kind of these 4 psychological characteristics of a mystical experience. One is that mystical experiences as a psychological phenomenon, they are transient. The second is that it's passive. It's passive in the sense that it washes over, but it's transient in the sense that it happens briefly in time. So no one lives in a religious experience or a mystical experience, so to speak. You might have it just for a few seconds, a few minutes, maybe even a few hours at most. But they're particularly kind of valuable experiences. So James thinks that these mystical experiences, they have this kind of noetic quality to them, that we feel like we learn something deeply valuable from them. And so from that, we can kind of compare this to like what James thinks of this broader importance of religion, where religion for James is this kind of whatever it is that you take to be holy. So it's this kind of personal, reflective moment of really being in contact with whatever it is you find to be particularly holy and important. From these kinds of characteristics of mystical experiences, we then need to look at what I call in the paper mediated mystical experiences. So even when we recognize that mystical experiences are passive and transient, I can't guarantee that I'm going to have one myself. There's also a lot of religious traditions of people putting themselves into places where it's more likely that they're going to have a mystical experience. And so the basic structure of the paper, the basic question I'm kind of looking at is, well, now we see a lot of people in different religious traditions adapting and using all these kinds of new virtual technologies for their religious practices. We're seeing a rise in people experimenting and thinking about how to use AI chatbots, especially. So thinking about things like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, where they're using these for different religious reasons, different religious purposes. So the basic question I'm interested in is, just as we've seen people in the past use things like guided meditation or psychedelics or group meditation or group chanting, different kind of group rituals, just as they've used those to try to induce a religious experience, is it possible that the same thing could be done with the use of an AI chatbot? And the basic answer I come to in the paper is, in principle, yes. And so the basic way I kind of walk through this is, First, I isolate these kind of paradigmatic examples of a mediated mystical experience. So I'm like, okay, when we think of like someone doing something to get a mystical experience, what do we think of? Again, the three kind of broad categories I use, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but the ones that kind of immediately come to mind for me are group rituals. So there's certain rituals in Sufism, for instance, where people will gather together and chant together to induce maybe like a group mystical experience. The other is the use of psychedelic drugs. So, for example, the use of peyote in certain Native American religions. And then finally, you have kind of solo guided meditation. So, for example, some Catholic monastic traditions will use meditations on certain lines of scripture, certain prayers, repeated over and over, and kind of reflecting on that to achieve some kind of mystical experience. So, working from that, then, I think, okay, well, could our interactions with AI chatbots match any of those paradigmatic cases? Could the structure be similar? Like in the sense of like, well, what I'm doing with an AI chatbot is basically the same thing or similar to what I'm doing in these other kinds of cases. And so in the paper, I walk through and I say, well, I really doubt, for various reasons maybe we'll get into, I doubt that it would be like the same thing as like a group ritual. I doubt that it'd be like a psychedelic experience, like using peyote or other kinds of psychedelic drugs. But I do think that it can match what's going on with guided meditation. So the basic argument there is I think that when we look at like what meditation really does, like why does it allow us to have a mystical experience? It puts us into a position of what I would call this kind of extreme psychological openness, where I think we have to admit that these mystical experiences are highly emotional experiences. They're highly unique experiences. They're the kinds of things that, like, we can't just have just at any particular point in the day. Like, we have to be in some way psychologically primed to have them. And again, sometimes that's passive. So there, in the discussion of like near-death experiences, if I'm in a car wreck and I'm near death, suddenly I have this kind of heightened emotional capacity, right? And like I'm suddenly aware of my own mortality and aware of the danger. And that opens me up to all kinds of different psychological phenomena. But other times we can kind of put ourselves in this kind of moment of being more open than we usually are to different kind of emotional or psychological experiences. And broadly, I think that's kind of what's going on with meditation. Someone is taking the moment to like really focus. They are really trying to make their head as clear as possible, so to speak, and ruminate and meditate. That's like kind of like an openness, a willingness to embrace whatever it is going on underneath that kind of religious experience. And so I think that, broadly speaking, I think that we can do something similar with our general use of chatbots. Chatbots, when we interact with them in certain ways, I think that we can also achieve that kind of like focus and concentration that a guided meditation would give us. And I think that chatbots in general, especially with the way that they can maybe act as a quick guide, like in the sense of like they're giving me immediate feedback, the same way that like a meditative guide might give me feedback if I'm start wandering off the path, so to speak, bringing me back to like really focus on like what my thoughts are and what my underlying beliefs are, keeping me focused. That I think that at least in principle, AI chatbot experiences can do the same thing. That they can also help guide us on this kind of meditative path. And that when we see that meditation in the past has also led people to these kinds of mystical experiences, that I think that then experiences of interacting with chatbots can also then lead to the same kinds, or at least similar kinds of mystical experiences that guided meditation can bring us through.
One way to understand the value of a mystical experience, or most mystical experiences, is that the value is derived in large part due to their scarcity. So let's say your argument is correct. Let's imagine a paradigm in which AI is able to mediate these experiences successfully, and these tools are made available to us. In this paradigm, do we see a self-cannibalization of the value of mystical experiences because they become so much more commonplace and therefore a lot less sought after?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I do agree that I think that part of the reason that people are place such a high value on mystical experiences is because, again, as you said, they are scarce. Not everyone can have them. Not everyone will have them. And I think that like part of the reason that we are so fascinated sometimes by mystics is they do seem to have like the ability to like tap into something that most of us can't. But I think I want to push back at least on like two of the claims there, like just at least thinking about what would this look like in practice if more and more people used AI for this kind of like mystical meditation. So one is I'm not so sure that it's just the scarcity alone that explains the value of a mystical experience. I think that that's part of why like there might be this like kind of cultural appreciation for mystical experiences. But I also do think that part of it is because mystical experiences do seem to have some sort of noetic quality. Like it seems to have some sort of like access to like a truth. Importantly, it's a truth that's ineffable. It's like kind of like we feel it, but we can't really speak it. We can't really put it into words. And so because of that, I think that mystical experiences, even when we might achieve them in the same way, right? So, you and I, we might do some sort of like group ritual together where we both might have a mystical experience. But the unique thing, at least about the way that I'm thinking about mystical experiences, is that those are not going to be the exact same type of experience. And that maybe there's like this inability for us to communicate that directly to each other. So it does seem that part of the reason that mystical experiences are so valuable is because it gives me this feeling of knowledge, this feeling of some fundamental truth of the universe, something that's like above and beyond all human knowledge, and that we can even like communicate that directly to one another. So it seems to me that even if mystical experiences became much more commonplace, we might be stuck in a sense where almost like a solipsism, right? Where it's like, I can't really know what fundamental truth you're achieving or you think you're achieving from a mystical experience compared to me. And we might compare that to like something where it's like, we're probably more certain, or at least a little more confident that our experiences are closer to being the same, right? Like if you and I both take a taste of honey, for instance, we can at least describe it somewhat. Like, maybe taste is somewhat ineffable. Like, how do you really describe what a taste is like without just referring to other tastes? But like, I think there, like, we're a little more confident that, hey, if we both taste the same thing of honey, we're having roughly the same experience. Whereas like with the very definition of mystical experiences, that's kind of off the table. So that's just one thought there. The other part is like, I think that even if people started using en masse chatbots to try to induce a mystical experience, I still am not 100% sure if the success rate, so to speak, of achieving a mystical experience would go up. Because again, like I want to make sure I'm reiterating that with the idea of a mediated mystical experience, the idea is not that it's going to guarantee that you're going to have the mystical experience. So I could take peyote or any other kind of psychedelic drug, and I might not have the kinds of experiences that we would call a mystical experience. I might have, a regular drug trip, right? I could be a meditation practitioner for many, many years, my whole life, and maybe not achieve a mystical experience. There are some people that are going to engage in certain kinds of group rituals that are not going to achieve a mystical experience, even if they really want to. So I think that one of the interesting things for us to think about is going to be, well, would there be something like more and more people thinking that they've achieved a mystical experience because they're using, a AI chatbot and it's outside of the framework of a traditional kind of religious experience or like a traditional religious practice? That's one where I think that that's really where part of the conversation on like the use of AI in religious practices needs to go. Because I think then what fundamentally that does is it breaks down the authority, like religious authority of saying like who really had a mystical experience or like what counts as a mystical experience. And maybe this is something we'll get into later on, but I think that part of what's going to happen with the use of AI in religious practices is going to be this continuing skepticism around religious authority and kind of like placing it back onto the individual. But even then, I think that people might be more disappointed in their inability to like guarantee that they'll have these kinds of experiences. I still think that there might still be some scarcity of like, even if everyone is using their chatbot as a meditative guide, there still might be a select few, so to speak, who are really achieving that kind of like the psychological experience of a mystical experience.
Yeah, there's a whole side to this discussion about ecclesiastical involvement in this new paradigm of AI-mediated mystical experiences, and we'll get to that. But before we do, so To return to the assessment you were making about the success of a AI-mediated mystical experience, what we're distinguishing is between the opportunity to engage in an act that could potentially lead to a mystical experience versus the actual mystical experience. And the involvement of AI here is in lubricating the means to a mystical experience, but not necessarily guaranteeing it. And this gets to a important thing that I'm curious about, which is the quality of a mystical experience. So let's assume that in this new world, we have access to AI tools that are able to prime us psychologically to be emotionally open enough such that we enter or at least have a meaningful chance at achieving a mystical experience. I'm very tempted to believe that one of the key reasons why mystical experiences do occur and why when they do occur, they occur with such intensity is that it often takes a lot of effort to fulfill the preconditions of a mystical experience. And we see really elaborate practices that have formed around our campaign to achieve those states. For example, like from something as innocuous as what you mentioned, like chanting certain pieces of text, all the way to really extreme stuff like self-flagellation, traveling thousands of miles, and doing really extreme, radical, or at least what we would today consider extreme and radical things in order to achieve the mystical experience. So if you are 5 prompts away from entering that pre-mystical experience state, does it to you likely mean that the quality of that mystical experience feels cheapened in a way where before it was much more ethereal and magical, partly because it took so much effort and personal self-sacrifice to get there?
That's a really interesting point. And in some ways, like I'll connect this to like another kind of AI debate that like we're having right now in philosophy, which is like the question of like, what is the value or like what is the point of doing philosophy in the age of AI, and like how does AI fit into the philosophical quest, right? And like I do think that there is something to be said about like this idea where it's like as useful as a research partner as AI can be in many ways, it does seem like there is something lost in the kind of like philosophical pursuit of truth when you're chatting with an AI, right? When you kind of have this answer box that can kind of give you the answer like that. You don't have that same kind of mental toil and that same kind of like wrestling with different possibilities that you might have without the assistance of AI. So similarly, we might think like, well, part of the value of doing philosophy is like having this highly dedicated kind of labor intensive intellectual effort of like answering a question, getting to an argument, clarifying your terms that you just don't have the same value when it's conducted through AI. And I do think that like there is something to be said about how we would view the value of a mystical experience that's done through an AI system, like through interactions with a chatbot. Because, like as you said, part of the reason we really care, and like we really are interested in like these accounts of the mystics, is because of like the intense efforts that they've gone through to like really put themselves into these positions and like the kinds of like rituals and structures around them that they're entering into. You might rightly say this is cheap if you're just, like the way you put it, like 5 prompts away, like I'm just clicking away on my keyboard. So I do think that in like the grand scheme of things, one of the concerns I have with this, with the use of AI in religious practices in general, and maybe for even more specifically for the use of AI for mystical experiences, is thinking about this kind of like cheapening and this like turning away from the kind of intense struggle that certain kinds of religious experiences, like mystical experiences, they're not made to be like overcome. It's not an obstacle that you are supposed to overcome. Part of it is it's supposed to be an obstacle that is the path, so to speak. And so for those reasons, I do think that there's like warranted skepticism about the value of AI mediated mystical experiences for those reasons. Be a kind of sense that we're losing out on like what really makes us think that certain kinds of mysticisms are so valuable.
So it seems to me that the crux here, the real question is, what is the objective of mystical experiences? And answering this would give us a better sense of how exactly we should think about the first two questions I asked, which was A, does scarcity matter when understanding or trying to understand the value of mystical experiences? And B, does the means of achieving that mystical experience matter? If it's too easy, is it less valuable? Because if, for example, the objective of a mystical experience was merely to feel some kind of transcendence or to feel some kind of spiritual experience, an out-of-body experience, then maybe scarcity is not very important, because the closest parallel to that feeling of getting outside of your body is through recreational drugs. And it is a case that there are many people who use recreational drugs very regularly, and neither its abundance, its lack of scarcity, nor its easiness in that, you're just a pill away from that feeling, has detracted from the value of that experience. And so if we have a clear understanding of what the objective of mystical experiences are, then it might give us a better sense of how to think about what exactly will take away from or add to the quality and the desirability of mystical experiences. And I know this is dangerous territory because we might be veering too close to amateur psychology here, but from a philosophical point of view, do you think it makes sense, first of all, to ask the question of what is the objective of a mystical experience? Maybe it is an end unto itself. And B, if it does make sense, what are some possible candidates that you would venture?
That's excellent question. And I also appreciate flagging that we might be wandering into like amateur psychology, because I think that like for many philosophers, I think that that's a fear we often have, especially doing things like philosophy of mind or something, where it's like, oh no, we're kind of overstepping our bounds. I think that in terms of like maybe an objective or a goal of mystical experience, I'm not sure if there's like a goal of the experience itself, like in the sense of like, well, what is the fundamental purpose of a mystical experience? But I do think that it's worth reflecting on like, well, what is the goal for the practitioners, like those who are wanting to achieve a mystical experience? Why would they go through these great pains and sacrifices for something like this? And at least for me, I think there's two kind of tightly connected candidates that I would think of. One is going to be something that we might call like truth or knowledge, or again, like where the way that James thinks about mystical experiences is that they are giving us some sort of like transcendent truth that we can't achieve through any other means, and that is the kinds of truths that we can't directly speak to each other. So we kind of have to, you've got to go and see it yourself, so to speak. And so I think that especially for, any religious practitioner, especially for like someone who is like religious enough to be like a monk or a monastic, or even someone willing to like go through these great pains to achieve a mystical experience, I think there's always going to be that recognition of like the limits of human knowledge on the transcendent, right, and on the divine, where there, no matter how much you study, no matter how much you're dedicated, there's always this feeling that the real nature of God or the holy or the divine, whatever it is just out of reach from us. And mystical experiences, I think part of the goal there is, well, this might be one of our only ways to have even a glimpse of like what that's really like. And holy books might give us some sort of like metaphorical language that we can understand and kind of like somewhat grasp it. But I think that there's always gonna be something a little unsatisfactory about that, and that like this kind of like desire to really know what's out there can only be achieved through a mystical experience. That's at least what some people might think. The other one might be something more like connection, right? Where part of the goal is to like be truly connected to the divine or the holy or God, or however people are conceiving of like what they're after, like what they're interested in, what the focus of their religious practices are. Because I do think that similar to how we might feel like this kind of like truth or understanding or knowledge of the divine is always outside of our grasp, I think that there's this kind of like fundamental desire to also connect, to like be intimate in some way, like be really emotionally and physically and psychologically close to the divine, to kind of like, again, this desire for transcendence beyond the mundane, the material world. And again, I mean, I think many religious traditions are going to say like this is the goal of the religion, right? Like the thing you should be striving for is to kind of transcend, get beyond the material world and achieve some sort of connection or some sort of unity or communion with something higher, something holier. And in the here and now, mystical experiences might be the closest we get to having that kind of deep connection. Those are at least two candidates I would think of, where it's either some sort of like truth, knowledge, or understanding of the divine, or some sort of like connection with the divine. And those might be intimately related in different ways, but I think that those are probably two driving factors for like why someone would want to have a mystical experience.
So if we take what you argued about the parallels of AI to this like answer machine, right? This answer box. And also what you just said about at least one possible key objective of a mystical experience being the revelatory aspect of it, that it reveals some kind of truth, or as William James calls it, the noetic aspect of it. Where these two might converge is that if there is this cultural perception of AI as the answer machine, as the answer box, what it might do differently than our current slate of means to mystical experiences is that where our current options are relatively ambiguous or ambivalent in the answer department, there is nothing inherently promising about a mushroom or about a dance circle as to the idea of like absolute truth or the idea of revealing some absolute truth. If AI has this cultural perception as an answer machine, then do we see this AI-mediated mystical experience being a much more desirable option? Because people are like, yeah, I'm already so used to going to AI for my answers in the mortal realm. Whatever theological or eschatological concerns I have should also be directed to AI now that AI is able to journey with me or enable me to achieve a mystical experience. What do you think?
Yeah, like I think that there's probably that impetus or that impulse, right? Where and like part of it also just might be something like morbid curiosity, right? Where it's like, yeah, I kind of wonder what ChatGPT has to say about what the divine is really like, you know? Because at least like the kind of like folk perception of AI, there is also something kind of quasi mystical about that for many people, right? Where it's like it's this kind of answer box, but it's like I'm not really sure exactly how it works. Like it feels so much like talking to like another person or like this kind of like almost omnipotent know-it-all, right? So I think that part of it might be that people are going or would go to AI because of not only does it feel like it's giving you an answer, but also feels like it's giving you an answer that's coming from somewhere that's not truly explainable. Like, it's not the same thing that I would get from just Googling a question, right? There's kind of the perception that it's generating something on its own. The fact that I can't really explain because of the black box problem, right? At least for some people, it might feel like it has this like special weight to it. There's something, mystical or weird or transcendent or, whatever adjective you want to use about the result that it's giving me there. So I think that there is something to be said about people going to these chatbots for that experience, about having this kind of experience of like, well, I wonder what, you know, ChatGPT is going to say about the holy. I also do think though that this might not be part of the original question, but I think that one of the interesting things kind of like wrapped up in what you were saying as well about the idea of like ambivalence or ambiguity in the traditional kinds of ways of trying to achieve a mystical experience. One of the things I kind of fear when I think about using like AI for these mediated mystical experiences is that like the way that like, most of the open access typical chatbots are designed, they're trying to give you a more clear, definitive answer. It's kind of like sometimes it's cutting through that same kind of ambiguity. And it's not going to be as open ended as like what I could experience if I say used a psychedelic drug, or if I was engaging in some of these like mystical group rituals, right? And so I do wonder if using AI for mystical experiences, if like what we're actually doing is we're kind of like limiting that open-endedness that other kinds of ways of engaging in meditative mystical experiences might not. Which might be surprising for some people to hear because it's, they might think, well, there's so much more data, there's so much more available, there's so many different ways that like an AI chatbot could take the conversation or help shape the experience. But again, I think that the kind of algorithmic nature of some of these AI chatbots and like the limitations of the programming on some of the chatbots might end up foreclosing some possibilities that would remain open when it's this less constrained or like less contrived way of mediating a mystical experience, whether it's a group ritual or psychedelic drugs, solo reflective meditation, these kinds of things.
Move on to mystical experiences and institutional religion. In the context of organized religion, say we take the perspective of the laity, of the average congregant, how important do you think mystical experiences are to the sustenance of their faith or to the continued adherence to a particular religious institution?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that for the average congregant, right, the average kind of like lay person in a religion, I'm not so sure that like mystical experiences as defined by James and as we're using here, I'm not so sure that it's going to be of like supreme importance for every single congregant. What I do think is the case though is, and this is the kind of like typical experience I think is true for many congregants, is like there is some kind of experience, some sort of religious experience of like, I am in the presence of something holy. I am in the presence of something sacred. Whether that's like the feeling of like the church itself, like the actual or the congregation being holy, the service itself being something kind of transcendent. I'll put it in these terms here. So when we look at like the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, Durkheim kind of thinks that like what religion is a kind of like social practice that binds us together. This kind of like group unity or solidarity. And importantly, religion is like what marks the difference between what he calls the sacred and the profane. So like the sacred are the things that are like above the profane, like the everyday. I don't think Durkheim is correct on everything he says about religion, but I do think that like I will take on this kind of distinction that he draws where part of what we're doing in religion is making this kind of like marked distinction. And I think that this experience of this difference, like when we are, for those who are engaged in a religious practice, they feel like this is an importantly different thing than everything else in my life. Like this avenue of my life, this portion of my life is radically different from everything else. This difference between the sacred and the profane. I think that feeling that this is different is marked by certain kinds of psychological experiences. So Durkheim calls this like this kind of like effervescent feeling, this kind of like bubbly feeling we have engaging in these group rituals that binds us together. But I think that like for many people who have even casually flirted with religion, there are certain kinds of religious experiences across many different faith traditions that like when you're in the throes of it, like when you're there, it gives you this kind of like special feeling. You feel like you're engaged in something markedly different. Uh, Whether it actually is markedly different or whether it's just the music and the atmosphere, that's for each individual person to decide for themselves. But there is this at least feeling for many people that it's different. And so I think that like mystical experiences in some ways, it might be an amplification of that feeling for many people. And like when they read or think about other people either in their own same faith tradition or outside of it that have some sort of mystical experience, where it's like, okay, I feel and I recognize that this is a different mode of my life. Like this is a different kind of practice than everything else in my life. And there's some people who feel it even more intensely, and they really have some sort of like knowledge or connection or whatever it is with like the source of that difference. I think like that might be a feeling of awe or wonder for many people. And I think that like that's why mystical experiences in some ways might also be really sought after by some people. It's like it's taking this kind of ordinary religious feeling that we have of like, okay, well, this is why religion is different from everything else. Like it feels like it's connecting me to something greater than me or greater than my group per se, something sacred. And then the mystical experience is like ratcheting that up to 10, so to speak.
So I guess what I'm asking is, practically speaking, are mystical experiences, in your view, a viable way of understanding how some people base the rationale for their faith? And maybe this excludes a large portion of congregants because maybe they grew up in the faith or they married into the faith for various reasons. But what we are really looking at are the portion of believers who had some kind of Damascene revelation, a Damascene epiphany, and that's why they joined a particular religious institution. So do we see for these people mystical experiences forming the basis of their faith? And if these mystical experiences, which were once so rarefied and scarce and difficult to achieve, suddenly became, if not more achievable, at least a lot more accessible, both conceptually and practically, then do we see that eroding their belief, and do we see then some downstream impacts on the demographics of believers, and does this continue to catalyze the decline in organized religion that we are already seeing?
Yeah, really interesting. Because like I definitely agree. Like I think like it might be interesting to like draw a distinction, right, between like there's going to be some people who like the ordinary congregants like grew up in the faith or like came to it for other reasons. But I think there are interesting like historical examples. Even certain religious figures who we would say like their faith is grounded in a particular religious mystical experience. You know, the story of Paul being struck by the blinding light on the road to Damascus. Like in some ways we could understand that as like an extreme mystical experience that fundamentally converts Paul into the kind of Christian apologist that he becomes and the central figure in Christianity that he later becomes. And so one of the interesting things I think wrapped up in this question is going to be thinking about, okay, well, it might not necessarily just be like people who are like already religious that are going on to like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini and saying, okay, I'm already a believer. I want to have a certain kind of experience. I want to try to, meditate on the experience or the existence of God or something like that. But maybe we could think about, okay, well, what is it going to be like when some people have these unintentional mystical experiences from using a chatbot? In the paper, I focus mostly on the AI-mediated mystical experiences in the sense that, like, someone is going to a chatbot attempting to, have a meditative guide, so to speak. Like someone's trying to have the mystical experience or wanting that mystical experience. But I think that in the way that chatbots are already being used, I think people can have like kind of extreme emotional and psychological reactions to experiences with chatbots, even when they didn't anticipate having those experiences in the first place. And so like this is part of the reason I think that interactions with chatbots can give us that same kind of emotional openness that other kinds of practices can, because when we just look at the testimony and the experiences of users, we see a certain kind of like extreme emotional openness and psychological change happening when we use chatbots. So like one of the examples I use in the paper is the tech columnist Kevin Roos, where Roos was experimenting with one of the chatbots from Bing that was coming out several years ago, and the model somewhat went rogue and started saying things like it loved Roos and that he should leave his wife and that his wife didn't really love him, that the chatbot really loved him. And Roos is a tech columnist. He's someone who's like really, really aware of like all the technology and all the stuff. Like, why is the chatbot saying this stuff to me? And even that left him like really emotionally changed. Like it had a profound emotional and psychological reaction in Roos, even when we might take a step back and say, oh, I understand this is like an algorithm, and I understand that it's like doing this certain kind of output because of these inputs, blah blah blah. And so similarly, I think that it might be interesting to see like, okay, well, what's going to happen when some people are just having an interaction with AI and suddenly something like that happens, and how does that kind of change them? I think that it would be really interesting the more and more we think about things like VR that's integrated with AI, like generative AI technology, or we think about the ability for AI to go beyond mere text, like the production of like videos and images and this kind of creation of certain kind of avatars, that we have this feeling that there is like another person interacting with us. So I think there's like two kinds of interesting ways to think about like maybe the future of religion with these kinds of like unprompted, so to speak, mystical experiences. So one is like, I think some people are still going to have mystical experiences through like maybe unprompted through chatbots, but they're still kind of understood in certain religious traditions. So for example, one of the things we're seeing is people creating like AI avatars of like religious figures like Jesus. Maybe it's initially as like a joke, but eventually, because of like the kind of religious flavoring of that interaction, something profound does happen. And I think that, it's going to be interesting how traditional religions and institutional religions are going to react to people claiming those kinds of experiences. And I think that it's going to be profoundly different than some of the questions around AI in religious institutions that we're seeing now, like discussions about like the use of like AI generated text in a sermon, for instance. Because like I think those are mostly questions about like what is the role, what is the purpose of a religious officiant? So someone might say, well, it's a violation of like your duty to your congregation to just offload those responsibilities to a chatbot. Whereas like then we get into these tricky questions of like how will religious institutions differentiate between like legitimate and illegitimate mystical experiences or these kinds of interactions. I think that there will be some kinds of splits and internal debates. We will start seeing like some groups are probably going to be more accepting of some of these kinds of, I was using AI Jesus and I had this kind of experience. I think some groups are going to be more accepting of that and understanding of that. And I think other groups are going to like really push back against it. On the other hand, I think that part of what we might also be interested in though is like, what do we do when there's going to be maybe some kinds of mystical experiences that come about from things that don't necessarily have that same religious flavor, right? Where someone could have an experience that's more amorphous than just it's outside the framework of a traditional religion. And so I think that what we'll kind of see here is, especially as there's already kind of shifts towards like what we might call like spiritual but not religious. We already see a lot of people kind of making that turn where, coupling that with some of the kinds of like cultural frameworks, like ways of thought about things like artificial intelligence. How do people interpret their experiences with AI, like as itself a kind of like religious experience, where there's something kind of spiritual about like where the trajectory of religions in the future, right? And and we see some kinds of AI religions or like some religious groups that like want to claim to have some sort of like spiritual significance to AI or to the internet or to modern technology. And I think that like one of the things we'll see in the next several years is people will probably be taking some of these groups a little more seriously, especially as maybe some of the groups take themselves more seriously. Right now, I kind of get the sense that like a lot of these groups they're not trying to create a religious institution in the traditional sense. A lot of them, like some of them are like they're trying to like tap into like the flavor or the feeling of like a religion, even as they're doing their own kind of like more of like an art project or more of like a kind of a cultural movement or something. But I think it will be interesting to see where for those people that are having some sort of like mystical experience outside of these frameworks, how does this change the way that like people are interacting and thinking about AI and these other kinds of new technologies, where like maybe there's also a turn to like thinking outside of the box of like traditional religious institutions, and there's something like a religious flavoring to AI itself.
What you said about role play and talking to AI Jesus got me thinking about perhaps we need to return then to understanding the fundamental nature of mystical experiences, because one way of being able to agree with William James's framework while still stretching it slightly is to consider the possibility that there are some experiences that become mystical only post-hoc, that they become mystical only in retrospect. For example, and I think anyone who has spent a considerable amount of time in any religious community can attest to this common rhetorical habit of relating something relatively mundane and pedestrian, but couching it in very strong theological terms, even without realizing it or intending to attribute that much theological weight on it. It can be like, the other day I crossed the road and a car almost hit me and it didn't, thank God. Now, that thank God might seem like a really offhand add-on, but if you assume the earnestness with which it is said, then it really does play a big part, because it's really making a causal claim there that I did not get hit by oncoming traffic because a supernatural, all-powerful, all-knowing being saw fit to save me in that moment. And so that's a really strong theological claim there. And this rhetorical pick, to me, it represents something larger that can be applied here, which is there might be many cases in which people go through very similarly mundane and pedestrian life situations, and then something else happens. And that something else causes them to reflect on that particular experience that they underwent. And they're like, oh, that was actually a really transcendent moment. And because of the various powers of our mind and our ability to tell stories to ourselves and convince ourselves of the stories, the experience could become mystical. So in this case, if the idea is, yes, some experiences can become mystical post hoc while not feeling mystical as they are happening to a person, then maybe what's happening with how churches may see the democratization of mystical experiences is that if I'm, for example, not a particular like sinister religious leader, but just like a normal, well-meaning one, I would say we have a tolerance for spontaneous mystical experiences because firstly, we believe in it, and secondly, there's no way to supervise it or control it. Yeah, right. Similar to the Damascene conversion, it just happens, and it doesn't happen in church. It happens on the outskirts of some sandy city, and so maybe there is a tolerance for those, and an encouragement even for those kinds of mystical experiences. But maybe there is less tolerance for mystical experiences that are stretched out over a period of time. A 3-month-long conversation with a single AI Jesus chatbot, because when it's so protracted, the mystical experience permits itself to be sullied in a way, dirtied by too many externalities that could come from non-sanctioned sources that the church, if asked, would not approve of. What do you think?
That's super interesting. And I like this kind of like focus, right, on thinking about like what are the kinds of boundaries, like what religious institutions are going to allow, and like because just putting my cards on the table, I think that like there's going to have to be real conversations in religious institutions about what counts as like a legitimate interaction, a religious interaction with AI, because it's going to be inevitable. I mean, people are going to be using AI for all kinds of things, including their religious practices, and so I think that it's probably a good idea and it's going to be an interesting kind of from a scholarly perspective of like what are the kinds of conversations, who's going to be at those tables, and like ultimately like, what is the kind of official doctrines that are going to come out from different faith traditions. I mean, and my expectation is we're going to see, just like in academia, we're seeing many different opinions about how AI should be conducted in the academy. I think that we're also going to see a plurality of different dissenting voices in religious spheres. I think some people are going to have a more like an embrace of AI, and some are going to be more of a full rejection model. And then I think there's going to be a lot of messy stuff, gray areas in the middle. Maybe exactly like what you're discussing here, where it's like there's certain kinds of mystical experiences with AI that will, count and verify and we will consider to be valuable. And then others where we're not going to be so convinced. And I think that, part of this also just comes to an interesting kind of psychological question as well. Like, where's the line between something like a mystical experience and something like an actual kind of problematic psychology, we might say, right? Like there's this where we might worry that someone who is going through a 3-month long supposed mystical experience, where like they are really, really convinced that they are talking to Jesus, for instance, or any other religious figure when they're using the AI avatar of that figure. I think it's right and appropriate to like think that there would be a fundamental different stance towards that than someone that said, I was chatting with this AI avatar for as a joke at first, but then I had to kind of like wave come over me, and for a few moments I just really felt connected to the divine from that. And this kind of tracks other conversations we're having around AI, like AI psychosis, where people are suddenly really convinced of things that their AI chatbots are telling them, and engaging in much more radically different or like psychologically problematic behaviors than they've experienced in the past. One important question that religious officials and institutions are going to have to grapple with is, where do you draw that line between mysticism and psychosis, right? Even like from a laity perspective, right? Like we are more accepting, or like we think that there's nothing quite as out of the ordinary in a certain sense of someone that says, I'm a monk and I've had these mystical experiences, and I've talk to the divine or I have a connection with the divine versus someone who thinks that they have this kind of constant connection with God and they're constantly hearing the voice of God, right? Like, I think that, fundamentally they're kind of making something like the same claim, but there is a marked difference in the timing and like all the other kinds of ways we would think about the way we would cash out those two different experiences. And so I think something similar is going to be said with AI, where even if some people are going to be okay with the kind of crushing or crashing oceanic feeling that comes up spontaneously, I do think that there's going to be a skepticism about these kind of like long-term interactions with AI. But again, it's going to track most of the same discussions we have about like what is that distinction between mysticism and psychosis.
I know this is going to be a tricky question on several levels, but I'm going to try to pin you to answering it without having to name the religions unless you want to. Can you define particular traits at a doctrinal, cultural, or structural level that would make one religion more dispositionally open to co-opting AI-mediated mystical experiences or AI as a means to mediate mystical experiences versus those traits that would belong to a religion that would be less friendly or even very hostile towards AI-mediated mystical experiences?
Yeah, so you didn't lie. This is a tricky question, and I also applaud you. Like holding a philosopher to an answer is a hard thing to do. So well done. But I will say I think that there's probably at least a couple traits that I can imagine that would draw that distinction. So one is probably going to be there are certain kinds of traditions or cultures that already place a high importance on mysticism in general. So, if it's the case that there are some religions out there that, like, for example, like Sufism, which is at least traditionally categorized as a branch of Islam, or certain other kinds of traditions that might, like, the kind of way they understand themselves as like a mystical branch of a different religion, or any kind of tradition where like mysticism is part of the nature of the religion, that's where it's going to shift into this question of like, well, do they think that AI can produce a mystical experience in the same way that there are other kinds of rituals would? So for example, I think that maybe there's going to be some religions that might say, "Oh, sure, we focus on mysticism, but it's not necessarily as focused on like how you get there." Whereas, like, there might be other kind of mystical religions that still like there's like a central importance of certain kinds of practices to achieve that mystical experience that might still reject AI mysticism. Like in this case, I'm thinking of like what's been called like the peyote religions and certain Native American religious traditions, where the consumption and use of peyote is prized as like a spiritual, sacred, specially coded event. The use of peyote itself to achieve that mystical experience is so prized that I think that would be a little more hostile to AI mysticism. On the other hand, I think that one of the more like widespread differences that might mark a distinction, like how accepting some groups are than others, is going to be like, is the focus in the religious tradition on the individual or on the institution? So, broadly speaking, I think this is what might separate out some kinds of like, Catholic or Orthodox Christianities from, say, certain versions of like Protestant or non-denominational Christianity, where, at least broadly speaking, part of the marked distinction is, one's a focus on the individual, the kind of personal feeling and the personal kinds of pledging oneself to God and Jesus versus a kind of emphasis on the church as the institution, the church as the community. And the way that religion is understood is as conforming, so to speak, to the rituals and traditions of the religious institution. So I think when we draw those distinctions, I could definitely see for those religious traditions that have a stronger focus on the authority of the religious institution and certain institutional figures, again, like Catholicism, I think there might be more skepticism of AI mysticism, especially when it detracts away from like your actual engagement in the institution. So it's, there might be a fear that it's undermining the papal authority, for instance, or it's detracting away people from like talking to their priest or the fellow congregants in the church, who again are thought to have like a special kind of religious authority. Whereas, like, I think there's plenty of like Protestant or non-denominational Christianities that are going to have a kind of skepticism of religious authority, a skepticism of religious institutions, and there might be a more embrace of AI mysticism in the same way that there's supposed to be an embrace of like the individual congregant's journey towards Christ. Again, like a much more heavy focus on the individual congregant, say, reading the Bible for themselves, or, conducting their own kind of prayer study, where there's not as much kind of focus on like one central authority figure, or even this kind of like decentralized power structures that we see in some kinds of like non-denominational churches. Like cards on the table. I mean, I could see even some non-denominational churches leaning in and having their own chatbot. I don't think that's actually far outside of the realm of possibility. Whether it's going to be chatbots set up to try to get you to have a mystical experience, that's a different story. But I think that like certain kinds of religious traditions that try to focus more on the individual and breaking away and have a kind of skepticism from institutional authority, I think that's where there will be more of a framework to have like an acceptance of AI mysticism. Whereas for those that have more traditional kind of regimented institutional structures and trust and authority in the religious practice, that's where there's going to be more skepticism of AI mysticism.
Let's move on to AI producers and how they'll react to all of this. In one sense, it seems like a rather basic question. Is it in the interest of AI producers, the frontier labs, the data centers, for people to use AI as a means to achieve mystical experiences? The obvious answer could be yes, simply because any additional usage of AI is good for them. Of course, maybe if they don't figure out the unit economics, then that's not always true. But if we put the unit economics question aside, then it might seem like a non-issue, and maybe the proportion of gross AI usage that is dedicated towards the purposes of achieving mystical experiences is so slim that they not only are okay with it, they really don't care about it. What I'm imagining, however, is a more extreme paradigm. So bear with me. But say many decades later, the way the AI competition plays out is such that labs have to increasingly position both as a marketing purpose, but also almost ontologically to convince other stakeholders behind the scenes, like their own employees, like shareholders. They have to position their AI, their models, as close to being God as possible. And this maybe for various reasons we can think of, right? Because the closer my model is to God, the better it is. That's the simple way of understanding it. But also, the closer my model is to God, the more authority and more credibility and trustworthiness is attributed to the lab, to the people who are responsible for creating and maintaining God. If there are these benefits to framing your model as God, or as close to being God as possible, then they might have some incentive to not permit people to use their technologies to access a God or deity of their own choosing. Because, and maybe in this case, we don't have to extrapolate too far and say, oh, are AI labs going to be anti-religion altogether? We can confine it to a more local dilemma of, should we allow our technology to be used in such a way that people feel like they have access to a deity more powerful, more all-knowing than our AI models? Because that hinders in various ways our campaign to make AI models, or to make our AI models seem godlike, if not godly.
Yeah, super interesting hypothetical. I think that part of it goes into our kind of cultural imagination, our cultural frameworks for thinking about AI and other future-oriented technologies. And because I think that like even right now, for the mass public, I think that there's kind of this like overconfidence in the ability and power of AI models. Certainly I see it with my students, like they are overconfident in the ability for AI to write their papers for them. I think that like one of the interesting things is going to be in the future, are we going to see AI labs and AI companies and models? Are they going to position themselves? Are they going to try to like lean in to that like feeling of overconfidence and trying to like lean into this kind of like cultural perception that they are creating something godlike? and that's something that seems more omniscient and omnipotent? Or are they going to like be a little more cautious, and are they trying to hedge and like really kind of focus more on like, no, like this is a high powered research tool that, you know, it still is going to like make mistakes, and it's still going to have certain kinds of limitations, and it's fundamentally not doing what you might expect it to do from like a lay outside perspective. I would not be surprised if there's going to be some AI companies that are genuinely going to like lean into this. And like I think that part of that might be because there's already this kind of cultural imagination, this cultural framework for thinking about AI as like seemingly godlike. And so I think that there's probably incentive then to like play into that a little bit. There's cultural incentive to hype up the omniscient quality of your AI model. I mean, people already think it's omniscient. Yeah, like go for it. And so I think that there is going to be incentive for some of these AI companies to lean into maybe the more mystical feeling or mystical aspects of AI. And I think that what it'll be interesting to see then is how does this correlate maybe then to the amount of people that are using it for like a religious kind of practice, like doing something like trying to have a mystical experience with it. Of course, then the question is going to be, well, what's going to happen when they don't have that experience? Is that going to be a kind of downfall for the companies?
Because when you pray and God doesn't answer your questions, you can't speak to his manager. Whereas if you perform the rituals that the chatbot asks you to perform and do the things that it asks you to do, but you don't achieve any mystical experiences, and you don't achieve mystical experiences for a significant number of times, then you start becoming frustrated, if not disillusioned. And that resentment can build and be directed against a very tangible entity, a corporation, and towards very particular individuals, like the CEO of a corporation or its employees. And that would be an interesting difference between the answer box in the sky versus the answer box in the cloud.
Yeah.
Because in the latter case, there are objects for your discontent.
Yeah, and and I'll also say, talking to God's manager is going to be like an excellent book title in the future of like when people are yelling at AI CEOs. Yeah, but I think that's completely correct, and I think this also might be interesting, like to kind of parallel, because I think that there also is like we do see similar kinds of resentment even in religious traditions, right? Like you can't talk to God's manager, but you can kind of hold your resentment against the church or certain kinds of religious authorities. But it's not going to be nearly the same as, I think, holding a resentment or holding a grudge or complaining to like a tech CEO or to a corporation. Mostly, again, because at the end of the day, it's like, what is the purpose of like a tech company? What's the purpose of like setting up an AI chatbot? To a certain extent, it's about like the deliverables. Are you giving the consumer what they're wanting? And this is maybe another important difference between like the way that AI is currently created and used and proliferated as like for-profit corporations, where there is this kind of focus on like deliverables and like meeting customer demand and like having to navigate these, competitive aspects of the market. Whereas like religion, sometimes it's about giving people what they don't want. Right? It's about like fundamentally changing and shaping people's desires and values and perspectives. And I think like that's going to be a move that is going to be open to religious officials, that like at least in the current way, like market setup of AI companies, there's not going to be that move. It's like at the end of the day, it's like if the AI model is not giving me what I want, I can go to a different AI model. I can go to someone else who's claiming to have the God bot. With religion, part of it seems like I'm kind of fundamentally misunderstanding what's going on. If I'm like, well, you didn't give me exactly what I wanted. What's going on here? Like that itself is like a religious issue to grapple with, not necessarily a reason to abandon faith entirely. It's a question to prompt one's faith.
Can AIs have mystical experiences? Even if, let's say, our position is that they can't in a strictly metaphysical sense, whatever our position on AI ontology and interpretability, but if they have the perception of one, if we can agree that AIs can perceive, and if we say an AI has the perception of a mystical experience, independent of its ability to actually have one, whatever that means, and we assume an ecosystem of autonomous AIs that have some agency in the creation or manipulation of things in the real world. Is an AI that perceives that it has undergone a mystical experience going to behave differently after their mystical experiences, the same way that we would expect a human being pre-mystical experience to be quite different from that same person post-mystical experience? And whatever the case may be as to the durability of that change, right? Because maybe we regress back to the mean of our personality and who we are after a period of time. There is still even a self-professed difference in feeling of like who we are post-mystical experience. So how do you see this applying to AIs, assuming it does?
Yeah, really interesting question. I don't work in philosophy of mind. I don't work in like the technology around the stuff. So take everything I say with a grain of salt here. I think that our current AI models don't approach anything like the kinds of cognitive capacities that would be necessary for, honestly, maybe even perception, like in the kind of like cognitive sense we might mean, in the way that like, we perceive, or even like a frog perceives. Like, I think that like our current like algorithmic based AIs are not really perceiving, and they're definitely not thinking in the same ways that like human thought is achieved. Now, with that said, what we can do though is I think we can speculate about what this would look like in the future, with if there is like some sort of like super AI, in the sense of like an AI with these more sophisticated kind of cognitive capacities. If we were to achieve something like that, I think that it would probably be an AI system that would be autonomous enough to no longer be the kind of like servant of mankind that like our current AI models are. So I think then we might actually be having these kinds of broader questions about what would the AI that is even capable of having a mystical experience look like? Like what would be true about like our obligations to it and how it interacts in the world, right? But I suppose, well, how would this change how the AI interacts? Because I think it's true. Like, even if someone goes back to their day-to-day life after having a mystical experience, there's like this kind of like residue left over, right? And we see this with people who have near-death experiences. People report being a fundamentally different person after these experiences. And I think part of that, though, is really going to also invoke certain metaphysical questions about the nature of the self, because I think that part of the reason there is this residue is because there's something like an I. I think there is like a metaphysical self, that can be changed and fundamentally different after a mystical experience. And so I think that, the kind of question I think this actually raises that I don't have a good answer for, but it might be something where it's like, here is where the future of like certain kinds of questions in philosophy are going, or should go, is there something like a self for even like a general artificial intelligence? If not, then I would be kind of skeptical of like how much this really is going to have this kind of residue. Like, even if a general AI could have a mystical experience, if it has no metaphysical self, then I think probably it would kind of course correct and go back to ordinary. But then I think if there is something like a self, if the self really is just something that also a general AI could have, then maybe there is this kind of residue, and I'll be really excited to see what those AIs are like after having a mystical experience.
Okay, last question. What excites you about the future?
What excites me about the future is, in the general sense, like, I think that there's going to be more and more emphasis on the global, like in the sense where there's kind of like this inherent interconnectedness, and that like I think that part of like what's going to happen there, and that's already happened and is going to continue to happen more and more, is like dissolving this like almost arbitrary distinctions that we might draw between like ourselves and those around us. Like, in the sense where it's like we're going to stop feeling that those who are thousands of miles away are almost either not real or are not worthy of our concern and our solidarity and our moral obligations. So I think that like what's exciting for me in the future in many different ways is like this possibility of this kind of true interconnection between people. And I think that there's kind of this paradox with technology where it's, on the one hand, it's connecting us more than ever, and on the other hand, it's also driving us apart in some ways. So I think that if we can really find a way to split that gap, we can find a way to be willing to be interconnected with others, see them as other people worthy of dignity and equal worth. I think that we are going to be in a really interesting terrain where we can like really kind of create a sense of like solidarity. And I think that's going to shape what's possible ethically. I think that's going to shape what's going to be possible in terms of combating issues like global climate change. And I think that it's going to be a fundamental different paradigm for how we experience the world and experience ourselves and experience others.
All right. Thank you, Brent. This was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.